Everyone, I'm Mark Stolorow. I'm from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a part of the Department of Commerce. And I'm here to talk to you this morning about OSAC standard activities and NIST Forensic Science Center of Excellence. I'm just teasing. I actually am familiar with the information which is in this presentation, but I thought since Jerry was so organized, the least I could do was to try to show you that it's always possible not to be as organized as Jerry. And I promised not to have any jokes in this presentation at Jerry's behalf. So you've just heard all that I'm going to comment on. I have to meet with him next week, and I know that it's important that we continue a strong relationship, so I'm being nice to him for the rest of the presentation. In any case, it's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to return to the Prescriptions for Criminal Justice Forensics program. And as a forensic scientist, prescriptions have a particular meaning in the world of toxicology and controlled substances. And I'm not sure whether or not there is a prescription that gets administered before we leave today, but if that's the case, I'm more than happy to hear that. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is an update with what the Organization of Scientific Area Committees has done. And as Jerry mentioned, it's very broad in its stakeholder representation. We're trying to give voice to all of the relevant interested parties and contributors, and to tap resources which traditionally have not necessarily been tapped in academia, in the world of research, and stakeholders from the criminal justice community. The second thing is to share with you a recent announcement, actually it's only a week old, on the Forensic Science Center of Excellence, which NIST has been given $20 million to fund over the next 5 years, and I'll give you an update on what has happened with the award of that Center of Excellence. To begin with, I think referring to the NAS report in 2009 is a good place to start for the history of how the OSAC and the Commission of Forensic Science came about and what the objectives are. What is it that the national leadership in pulling together the relevant stakeholders of practitioners and criminal justice representatives is attempting to accomplish? And it does trace back even to before the NAS report, but the NAS report was certainly an accelerator in the process of forensic science, public attention to forensic science reform and the need for reformation. One of the things that was described in the NAS report in the executive summary was that forensic science disciplines too often have inadequate educational programs, and they typically lack mandatory and enforceable standards founded on rigorous research and testing, certification requirements, and accreditation programs. So one of the things that happened in response almost immediately in July of 2009 was the formation of a White House subcommittee on forensic science. It was out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. You saw a slide recently from Jerry indicating Tanya Simoncelli is part of the executive committee for the National Commission on Forensic Science. She's from OSTP. That's where the Subcommittee on Forensic Science originated. And I won't take you through the history of the Subcommittee on Forensic Science, but it was a lot of effort by a lot of people to try to give voice to stakeholders at the state and local level, as well as to hear from those laboratories in the federal government in 23 agencies, more than 40 crime laboratories, to try to address the 13 recommendations and the criticisms of the National Academy of Science report. And one of the things that we discovered, I recognize the other co-chair of that subcommittee sitting in the front row, Ken Melson. Ken's role in the Department of Justice made it appear very early on in the process that in order to have total transparency of the process of trying to develop recommendations and policy issues that affect the national leadership of forensic science and pulling all boats, making all boats rise as a consequence of that national leadership, that it was going to take the leadership of the Department of Justice acting as a federal agency in tandem with the National Institute of Standards and Technology to address the intersection of evidence and the court that the Department of Justice has long expertise in, and in standards development, measurement science, uncertainty measurements, and statistical probability models that can be contributed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So DOJ and NIST announced a partnership that they formed directly. There's a memorandum of understanding that you've already heard about that was signed in 2013 that led to the formation of these two entities, the Commission and the OSAC. There's also pending legislation. Gratefully, Stephen has made it from the train station here, so I won't add anything more with regard to pending legislation, and you will hear directly from Stephen shortly. So this identified a new role for NIST in this agreement to administer the OSAC. So this membership, as I mentioned, was signed to form these two entities. And one of the things that became clear, even in the investigations that were conducted by the Subcommittee on Forensic Science dating back to July of 2009, was that the forensic science enterprise is also hindered by an extreme disaggregation marked by multiple types of practitioners with different levels of education and training, different professional cultures and standards for performance, and a reliance on apprentice-type training and a guild-like structure of disciplines which work against the goal of a single forensic science profession. So the key here is a single forensic science profession. And for those of you who are in criminal justice, either as a practitioner or a litigant, you're familiar with the fact of how much diversity there is across the forensic sciences. The people who do work in one discipline may know little more than the layman about other disciplines in forensic science. And there are multiple types of practitioners with highly different levels of education. And there are some disciplines which still have a reliance on guild-like structure or apprentice-type training. It ranges all the way to forensic pathologists who, as practitioners, have an enormous amount of education. One of the things that I was always curious about in going to autopsies as a crime scene investigator and a novice working as a new person in the world of crime laboratories was how old forensic pathologists were. I don't know very many forensic pathologists who don't look older than I do, and I say that after 40 years of having been in this field. So I still had brown hair when I went to my first autopsy, believe it or not. But the reason is that we have people who have to be more than 30 years old by the time they finish their training. So we have some people who are very highly educated, and ranging all the way to people who have high school educations, became police officers, had a desire to learn about firearms analysis, and who came into the field and were trained in firearms identification after having spent the first part of their career as a patrolman or a police officer or as a detective. So we have this broad range. Over a period of time, Jerry didn't address this in his morning presentation. He was giving you an update on the commission. But the other hat that he wears as the director of the Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences, he can walk you through the patchy history of the development of many scientific working groups. And this chart is only intended to demonstrate that of the 21 scientific working groups that are listed, some of them are very young, and some of them have been around since the late 1980s and early 90s. They were very successful in helping to develop guidelines and protocols and a number of other services for each of the disciplines in providing documentation, bibliographies, accreditation, recommendations for certification, and so forth. And again, it was a little patchy. Some of them were excellent, and SWGDAM, the one on the top that's also the longest standing, actually has statutory authority that traces to the 1994 DNA Identification Act, empowering the FBI director to require DNA standards to be used in order for crime laboratories to submit DNA profiles to the National DNA Database. So that represents what the National Academies referred to as the gold standard, where you have a uniform set of protocols used by any laboratory in the United States that wants to submit a profile to the FBI National DNA Identification System. And it stands alone. All of the other disciplines in the United States use protocols which are either more or less variable than other laboratories among the 400 crime laboratories in the United States. So the NAS report refers to DNA as an example in a number of respects of why, as a discipline, there are attributes of forensic DNA, including a uniform set of protocols that are used across the United States. The purpose of this slide is just to demonstrate the degree of variability. It's not critical of the scientific working groups. Many of them achieved a great deal under very poor funding circumstances. But it's the nature of this variation which led to the criticism by the NAS report. So they said, and it's true, the efforts of these groups are laudable. However, it's not clear how they interact or the extent to which they share requirements, standards, or policies. Thus, there is a need for more consistent and harmonized requirements. The other thing is the enforceability. So once the SWGs have put together protocols or standards that they would recommend, the other question is how do those standards get enforced by practitioners that are in crime laboratories and other forensic service providers and law enforcement agencies? So in introducing or rolling out the OSAC in its initial presentation at the American Academy meeting in February of 2014, this particular nautical analogy was used to demonstrate that the work by individual disciplines, both the professional forensic science organizations that represent those disciplines, as well as the scientific working groups, were represented by a group of boats all pulling as hard as they could in a direction in their own boat, and the communication among and between those organizations was little. And the analogy that was drawn was to say that we saw the benefit of having them harmonized in a way that was recommended by the NAS, and we tried over a period of 6 months to acquire public comment. We met with representative organizations, including the chairs of the SWGs, and put together the organization which eventually led to the development of OSAC. The benefits of having OSAC together as a single organization was not only to provide funding support so that representatives of all of these disciplines would uniformly be paid to meet together and did not have to fund their travel themselves, that it would help develop enforceable standards in a unified effort that could also have greater influence and impact. And I love having the opportunity of talking behind Matt today, who talked to you about the efforts of the CFSO, which is certainly recognized in our community as one of the most powerful voices in Washington for representing the best interests of practicing forensic scientists, and the frustration that we have in not having greater influence and impact. So one of the things that we currently engage in, and I'm happy that Matt mentioned today that he is a member of the Quality Infrastructure Committee as one of the 3 resource committees on OSAC, because we have constant dialogue and frequent interaction, and there will come a time when OSAC will produce documents and operations which will be measurable and impactful on the development and improvement of the forensic science community. And that is an opportunity for us to have a greater voice in Washington through organizations like the CFSO. The Organization of Scientific Area Committees then was formed for forensic discipline-specific guidance groups. And guidance groups was an early term, and you may have read or heard in draft legislation the term guidance groups. It has morphed into scientific area committees. The objective of OSAC is to create sustainable organizational infrastructure, a single organization that's dedicated to identifying and fostering the development of technically sound, voluntary consensus-based documentary standards and guidelines for widespread adoption throughout the forensic science community. So the key there is the adoption. And in order for them to be adopted in 50 different states, in 400 crime laboratories with probably nearly 300 jurisdictions of authority, it has to be a value proposition. The quality of the standards and guidelines have to be meritorious on their face in order to be embraced, because it's largely voluntary. And Jerry talked to you about the carrots and the sticks. Matt did. Jerry's the one who administers the carrots and the sticks from NIJ. And you'll hear more about carrots and sticks this afternoon. But it has to be meritorious and embraced by the forensic science community and by practitioners in the criminal justice system in order to be impactful. And I'll talk a little bit more about enforcement later. So here is the hierarchical organizational chart for OSAC. For those who have heard this presentation before, and we spend a lot of time on outreach, traveling around the country to have presentations just like this one, you have seen this before. For those of you who have not, there is no chance in hell that in the remaining time that I have, I can explain to you the operations of this organization. So having said that, rather than get bogged down in it, I'd like to just pull some highlights out of the structure of the organization, how it was designed in a way to try to maximize lean and mean execution for efficient development of standards and technology, and bring to bear the resources of this new structure that the scientific working groups did not enjoy. So this is another way of looking at the organization. This is a functional organization chart, and at the center you see the resource committees and the governing board in the 5 segments that are colored around the outside. We have grouped together scientific area committees where there are disciplines that have similarities, and they fall into 5 major categories: biology, chemistry, physics, digital and media, and crime scene and death investigation. At the top of the organization is the governing board. To be responsive to the needs identified in the NIS report and to be true to the bilateral agreement with the Department of Justice and the responses that we had in Federal Register responses that was available, published by NIST for 60 days before we put together the blueprint for this organization, we decided that there would be the 5 SAC chairs, the 5 scientific area committees that you saw on that wheel, on the governing board, 6 professional association representatives, and the 6 largest forensic science organizations are represented with a representative elected and nominated by the professional association to the board. 5 members at large, all of them are academic researchers of standing, and 1 NIST ex officio member. The other element that we have, which is new, is having resource committees with subject matter experts in the legal resource committee, prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, and academic law professors. We have, and also Innocence Project subject matter experts. In the Quality Infrastructure Committee, there are 15 standard experts, including quality systems manager, lab managers, accreditation, and scientific certification specialists. They're responsible for writing and updating the code of practice and improving impact statements for standards and guidelines, and I'll go over that in a little greater detail. The third is human factors. So the Human Factors Committee is composed of 10 psychologists who are quality systems managers and usability experts to talk about the influence of human performance on ways to mitigate errors in practice, in forensic practice. So let's look at the balance that we have by employer classification. We have pretty much equal segments if you look around the chart: state government, private sector, local government, federal government, and academic. It's critical to make sure that we have sufficient voice from all of the relevant stakeholders to pull together and to have commitment as well as compliance. So we're looking for people who are going to take ownership for this project, and we're very grateful to have 542 members that occupy those 33 units of the OSAC. For job classification, there's an imbalance, if you look, in having more than half be practitioners. The one message that we heard loud and clear, and fortunately it was reinforced by both Jerry and Matt, in having indicated that in order for the right direction to be followed, we're more than happy to benefit from statisticians, researchers, academic research specialists, from educators and trainers, from judges and attorneys, but this is going to have a very large voice representing the practitioner community in order for it to be, in order for buy-in, in order for commitment to occur. So one of the things I wanted to mention to you, Jerry had said if you're interested in getting alerts when new information goes on the NIST website for OSAC events and information, there's a little brown box on the left-hand side in the middle of that column that says sign up here with your email address if you want to be alerted with email alerts, and it goes out through Gov Delivery. We have almost 6,000 people who have signed up who get the alerts whenever there's a new press announcement or there's a new output that we want to share publicly from OSAC. The other thing is that we have more than 1,800 applicants now in the applicant pool that include 542 voting members, but the other 1,300 applicants are all in the pool that are used for affiliates. When we need someone to populate the task groups, there are now more than 150 task groups working on standards and guidelines. And I'll talk a little bit more about where these standards and guidelines are coming from and where they go, but we only need to have a voting member on the task group, and the others can be affiliates, people who have indicated an interest and expertise in developing standards and guidelines, and it's the work of the task groups, which is really where the work in the trenches to actually develop the drafts comes from. So we have a huge amount of simultaneous or concurrent work which is under development, and to become an applicant, you go to this website, nist.gov/forensics, and there is an applicant form. So it's posted 24/7. We tap the applicant pool every 2 weeks and add to it to our master list. So if you're interested, please feel free to apply, and then contact the people in the relevant subcommittees for each of the disciplines. And by the way, at this website, there is also a complete roster of everyone who is on every one of these committees. So there's easy access to be able to identify who is on the OSAC, and you're free to reach out to them to volunteer. So we've launched the operations. The building of the structure is completed now. And in these outputs, I'd like to bring to your attention a couple of things. On the right-hand side, you see the OSAC registries. The two registries are the Registry of Approved Standards and the Registry of Approved Guidelines. The distinction between the two is that guidelines are best practices and protocols which are recommended. They may be recommended for a particular procedure, or for a particular instrument, or for a particular language used in report writing or in data collection and recording. The ones which are on the approved registry of standards, however, are distinguished because they're mandatory. So the language is shall rather than should. So in order to develop standards that can be used by the accrediting bodies need to have standards which are mandatory. And they can then embrace and adopt those standards as supplemental standards in accreditation to ISO 17025. The next arrow that you see is the catalog of external forensic science standards and guidelines. For that, we took the existing standards and guidelines that were published by the SWIGs. We have captured all of the legacy documents from those 21 SWIGs that sent us the links and the data that they have and the documents that they have from their websites and from their archives. And we will keep them open and perpetuate the availability of all of those documents. Thanks. And they become the basis for the review done by the OSAC to make sure that there is adequate scientific rigor for any new standard that will be posted on the Registry of Standards, and that there is open consensus, including public comment periods. So every one of the standards that makes it to the registry will have undergone a 30-day public comment period. And finally, we're looking for implementation. How do you enforce this? Well, largely voluntary through the Forensic Science Laboratory Organization, as well as accrediting bodies. And we have met with each of the accrediting bodies in forensic science, and they're eager to see the standards which are posted on the Registry of Approved Standards for incorporation into their inspections and audits in future years. So I mentioned to you before that we had a catalog of external forensic science standards and guidelines. This is just an example. If you looked at a snapshot, these are ASTM standards, 21 of them. The critical thing is that in order to adopt a standard, it has to undergo inspection to demonstrate technical merit, and that we used a reasonable standards development process, which is an open process with transparency, freedom from undue influence, and a balance of interests. So let me skip that one. The OSAC vision that I mentioned before, what is it that we're trying to achieve? I was asked, what does success look like 5 to 10 years from now? And the points that we have on here are only my opinion. Each of you is invited to try to define what you think success should be measured by in this organization if it's successful in developing and promulgating enforceable standards. The first was simply that forensic science practitioners embrace change. That's a hallmark of a scientist. Forensic analysis routinely employ quantification, uncertainty measurements, and probabilistic models to the extent possible in each discipline. That these registry of standards and guidelines actually get used in court. That prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges begin to refer to those registries when they're conducting direct and cross-examination. That there is significant forensic science research is finally well organized, prioritized, and well funded, with influence from OSAC to help inform the research priorities. And then finally, that standards enforcement by accrediting bodies finally becomes the rule rather than the exception. So I'd like to just conclude at this point by telling you that we have a Forensic Science Center of Excellence. You can go on our website. It was awarded to Iowa State University, and it was announced last week at the AFTI meeting. The partners are the Iowa State University, Carnegie Mellon, University of Virginia, University of California, Irvine. And they're going to be working on statistical foundation for fingerprint, firearm, tool mark, dental, and other pattern evidence, as well as digital for computer, video, and audio. So at this point, this is where I've run out of time and energy, and I'm going to leave voluntarily but I guess there is a panel session in which we can answer questions, and I'll be here all day. So thank you very much for indulging me, and I appreciate the time.